Welcome. It's my pleasure to have the first ever clinical urology and epidemiology CLU working group lecture, which I hope is going to be a tradition. I'm Kari Tikkinen, lead of the CLU working group, and Professor Alan Francis is our first speaker. In any areas of medicine, including surgery, including psychiatry, the definition of disease is crucial. You can say it lies at the heart of medicine. And very long time, doctors have been concerned about underdiagnosis and undertreatment. However, recently, more and more emphasis has been on overdiagnosis and overtreatment. Indeed, if you think about blood pressure, cholesterol levels, prostate cancer, it's always almost impossible to say where is the cutoff. How elevated should the blood pressure be to mandate treatment, or how aggressive should the prostate cancer be to proceed for surgery, which has risk of major complications. So I see it so that if we want to develop better medical science and better care for patients, we must have a eternal battle discussion between under and over diagnosis, because diagnosis lead to treatment. About 3 years ago, I was lucky and fortunate to participate in the first ever preventing overdiagnosis meeting, where we were presenting the results of our Finnish survey called FIND survey, where we tried to assess what is disease. And one day, it was a serendipity that we were in the same bus. We were both going to the shared decision-making clinic, which was the first in the world shared decision-making clinic at the Dartmouth Medical Center. And then this older gentleman happened to be there in the same bus. And then we decided to talk about definition of disease, then began to collaborate, and now today he is here. Alan Francis, welcome. Alan is a New York City boy. He was born there when I wasn't alive, but he also completed his pre-medicine and economics college in New York, then later med school in Brooklyn, then later residency in psychiatry, and then he became involved with the classification of disease first time in the DSM-IV. DSM is the American Psychiatric Classification of Mental Disorders. DSM-III was published in 1980. Then 7 years later, he was part of the DSM-3R, and then 1994 was published DSM-IV, which he happened to chair. And a couple of years ago, it was published the DSM-V, and Alan has been one of the people criticizing it because it expands the definition of disease, and actually all of us are now more or less disease according to the current definitions of many guidelines or classifications, including DSM. So today I'm extremely happy that we have the first ever CLU working group lecture, Saving Normal in Psychiatry and Medicine, by Alan Francis.
My pleasure. Coming from New York, I have a problem. I talk too fast. People in America constantly complain about this. If you find me talking too fast, don't be shy about slowing me down. That will work for about 10 minutes, and then you'll have to do it again and again and again. It's also, we have time, and I think it'll be more interesting if it's interactive. I'm told that the Finnish are shy, but in Sweden, I was told they were shy, and they turned out to be asking wonderful questions, and I will feel very let down if you don't do the same. So you're competing against your neighbors, and it would be a good idea for you to interrupt. If it feels like we're getting too far off track, I'll bring us back. But don't be waiting for a question period at the end. Raise your thoughts as you have them. Aldous Huxley said, medical research is making such astounding progress that pretty soon none of us will be well. And that's what's happened. And what we'll be discussing is the difficulty in defining diseases across all of medicine and psychiatry. The fact that the concept has no good definition, it's more a social construct than something we can apply from dictionary to patient. That the social forces have all been in the direction of widening disease definition to the point where now it's become somewhat absurd, not necessarily good for patients, and certainly not good for the society. But on the other hand, we have a terrible paradox that while we're over-diagnosing and over-treating people with mild conditions, at least in the United States, we're terribly neglecting people with severe conditions. That we're spending resources in a foolish way, harmful to those who get treatments they really don't need, and harmful to those who are neglected. We'll try to discuss some of the social forces behind this, and then some of the solutions, which actually are located in this room. That I think Helsinki at this point is one of the leaders in this area and shows great promise for being able to help save us from this problem. The problem of disease definition. If you look at a dictionary, you'll find that the disease is the opposite of being well. And you'll find that being well is the opposite of disease. That normal is the opposite of abnormal, and abnormal is the opposite of normal. That we have no good definitions of disease or health. That the World Health Organization has such a perfect definition of being healthy that no one can ever meet it. That the point is that you can't go from a written definition on the page to deciding which diseases should be included in a classification of diseases and which person has a disease and which person doesn't. Maybe show your slide. I first saw this man when he gave a talk at the Overdiagnosis Conference. It had about 350 people and over 100 talks, and his was the best talk, and this was the best slide. Are you familiar with what he did? An amazing survey with a very large sample in which he compared attitudes towards diseases from lay people, politicians. He had about 70 members of parliament. Was it 3,000 lay people? 1,500 lay people. About 1,000 nurses. About 600 doctors. This is an amazing survey. Now, you wouldn't go from a vote like this to what belongs in the manual, but it does tell you something about what people are thinking. If you look at the top, can you see it or not? Well, the top with all the green stuff, that means that the people say these are real diseases. The bottom with lots of red stuff says people are saying these are not real diseases. So what's not a real disease? Grief is not a real disease. I'll be telling you later that grief is a disease in DSM-IV, one of the real problems in DSM-IV. Aging is not a disease, otherwise I'm pretty sick. Smoking, not a disease. Wrinkles, not a disease. Homosexuality, baldness, not a disease. Transsexualism, not a disease. Motivational deficiency, not a disease. On the other hand, breast cancer is. Prostate cancer is. Pneumonia, lung cancer, juvenile diabetes, myocardial infarction. That there's great agreement about these being diseases. And then we have a lot of things in the middle, like chronic fatigue syndrome, work exhaustion, irritable bowel, where you have a lot of disagreement. Now, this is not the way to decide what's a disease or not by vote, but it's very interesting, especially since disease is more of a social construct than a medical certainty. Disease is what we decide disease is. Even here, though, you run into interesting problems. The best one is prostate cancer. He's the world's expert on this. It turns out that if we screen carefully for prostate cancer in a very large group of men, we will give a number of those men very invasive treatments. We'll make many of them sexually impotent, cause incontinence. If we give them hormones, we'll feminize them. It turns out that doing this serves no purpose, that the mortality rates are about the same. in people who get the treatments and people who didn't. Why is this? It's because screening tests have been so dumbed down that very, very benign, non-life-threatening conditions are now defined as diseases and treated aggressively. That most of the prostate cancers that are picked up through screening methods will not kill the person. They'll die with the prostate cancer, but it won't be the cause of death. That's part of life for many men to develop what's being called prostate cancer and not have that prostate cancer interfere with their lives. The treatment for it will be terrible for them. The findings on the cells, the biopsy, the tumor won't be. It's a real question that we've been debating. Should that be called prostate cancer? Should it be a disease? If you have something that's not going to kill the person, should we call that a disease? Should we be labeling disease based on a pathological slide or on the course of the patient's life? My feeling is that we've gone far too much in the direction of treating lab tests and forgetting the person. And that the only way of defining disease that makes any sense is based on utilities. The greatest good for the greatest number, the least harm for the greatest number. That if a condition causes less harm than the treatment for that condition, I'm not sure it makes sense to be diagnosing it or calling it a disease. That we should be restricting our area of interest to those situations where we can do some good, where we're less likely to do harm. Hippocrates, writing 2,500 years ago, had many wonderful statements, but three in particular. He talked about the rule of thirds. In America, this is very popular in with medical students. I'm not sure here. The rule of thirds. 1/3 of people get better on their own. Leave them alone. Don't interfere with their natural healing, because your treatment may add troubles without adding benefit. 1/3 of people don't get better with treatment, no matter what you do. Don't give them aggressive treatments that will make their life more difficult. Console, work with them to adjust to the situation. Don't make their life worse. Medicine should be restricted to the 1/3 of people where it's going to have a benefit. And the trick of medicine is figuring out with a given patient which third are they in. And we'll be discussing this with particular reference to psychiatry, because I know that best. We'll be discussing it with particular reference to the US situation. But the things that I'll be saying, mostly in reference to psychiatry, tend to apply to surgery and to medicine, and tend to apply around the world, because whenever the US makes a mistake, and we make lots of them, everyone copies it. And overdiagnosis has been copied all around the world in psychiatry and also in medicine. Hippocrates' conclusion: do no harm. The tendency in medicine is to focus on benefit because it's easier to measure, and there are powerful forces interested in benefit. We're much less good at measuring harms. It's harder to put a metric on harms, and there are powerful forces that tend to suppress the information about harms. So that when we're doing risk-benefit analyses, the tendency is to focus on benefit, to not pay enough attention to risk. Hippocrates said that's a big mistake. First, do no harm. The third statement he made that's pertinent to our discussion is that it's more important to know the patient who has the disease than the disease the patient has. That we should never lose sight on the whole person while we're focusing on a lab test. I have a friend who's dying of lung cancer, and I had to go to every visit with that person because the doctors were ordering things that made absolutely no sense because they were treating lab values. They weren't thinking about the whole person. They almost killed her with kidney disease and giving her imaging studies and medicines that would hurt her kidneys because they didn't have the sense to be thinking about the fact that she had another disease that was going to kill her, and they treated her and tested her very aggressively. So first, do no harm, know the patient. It takes time to know the patient. It takes very little time to make a diagnosis if you're careless. It takes a lot of time to make a diagnosis if you're careful. Now, what are we talking about? What's the epistemology here? There are three umpires. In the U.S., the best way of describing this, I'll do it the U.S. way and I'll try to translate it. You don't know baseball that much, I guess, right? Have you heard of balls and strikes in baseball? Okay, we'll try that. There are three umpires. This is the guy who judges when the pitcher throws the ball, whether it hits the plate or whether it misses. Is it too high, too low, to the right, to the left of the plate? Umpire 1. There are balls and there are strikes, and I call them as they are. Umpire 2. There are balls and there are strikes, and I call them as I see them. Umpire 3. There are no balls and there are no strikes until I call them. Now, this, in a very compact way, expresses an epistemological problem that has been the source of discussion amongst philosophers ever since Plato. Do we see the world in the way the world is? Or do we see the world equipped with our brains, which have limitations in the way they see the world? Or do we make all this stuff up? There's a guy named Bishop Berkeley in England who said that the world was pretty much a dream, a solipsistic view that we make it up. Do we see reality straight on? Or do we have a social construct that we agree on? Or is it a very idiosyncratic creation? Now, up until about 15 years ago, there was a real battle in psychiatry about this. There were some people who felt that psychiatric diseases were real, that schizophrenia was a real thing, and that we would understand it. We would be doing research on it, there would be laboratory tests for it, and we would really understand schizophrenia. Some of us, that would be the realist position. Middle Ages, that was called realist or essentialist position. Some of us were nominalists and said, the umpire calls the balls and strikes as he sees them, not as they are. That we don't see the world straight on. This is a point of philosophical distinction most emphasized in more modern times by Immanuel Kant. That we don't see the world straight on. The world is a construct. It's clear from neuroscience that that's the truth. That our brains are constantly constructing, out of the weird upside-down images we send them, a version of reality. Quantum theory makes clear that there's a whole very minuscule world that we can't even understand, where weird, spooky things at a distance occur. The understanding of black holes, the fact that most of the universe isn't visible to us, that we don't interact with the senses we were given by evolution. We can't even interact with black matter or dark energy or dark matter. We can only perceive 4% of the universe. We shouldn't presume that humans have the capacity to see the world straight on. We shouldn't assume that we have the capacity to find a simple answer for schizophrenia. On the other hand, there are people in psychiatry who deny that any of the mental disorders are anything but myth. That would be umpire 3. There are no mental disorders until psychiatrists made them up. It's the myth of mental disorder. Lately, the British Psychological Society has been writing in this vein to the extent of saying that we should get rid of all diagnosis, that we don't need medication, that basically if you talk to people who have very severe illnesses, that will be enough. The middle position is the position of a nominalist. It's much more humble. We see the world as best we can at any given moment. The disorders and diseases we conceive at any given moment are hopefully our best approximation of what the world's like, but never a clear one-to-one realization of the world. That we're making educated guesses at any given moment, and those educated guesses always seem stupid in retrospect. If we go ahead 50 years, our educated guesses now will seem as stupid as humoral theory seems to us. Humoral theory was first evolved in Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago. It was a very simple, elegant, brilliant idea, namely that our behaviors and our illnesses occur because we have an imbalance of body fluids. It's a biological model. If you have too much or too little of black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, or blood, You're going to get sick, and it'll also affect your personality. The smartest people in the world for 4,000 years believe this. It was a prevailing model. It was so compelling that it led brilliant people to do terrible things to patients. Based on the humoral theory, doctors gave patients heavy metals, especially mercury. They bled them because the feeling was too much blood was causing their illnesses. So you take people who desperately need blood and you bleed them. They made them hot. They made them cold. They made them throw up. They made them have diarrhea. They did everything possible to kill them. And yet doctors have always been admired. If you look at the history of medicine, it's often doing poisonous treatments that people thank them for and give them lots of money for. Why is this? The best medicine ever created is placebo. Placebo is the most powerful medicine in the world. This is sort of what Hippocrates was saying, that for most conditions, the placebo response rate's about 30%. And it also has a biological component. When you give a placebo medicine, often the biological effects you would expect from active medicine actually happen. People's behavior in response to medications absolutely astounding. So the fact that doctors were poisoning patients didn't result in doctors being killed. They were still admired because the patients often did better no matter what the doctors did, because the absolute power of the placebo effect, the absolute power of positive expectations. Schizophrenia will never be one disease. If anything, it's going to be hundreds and hundreds of diseases. What does that mean? When we describe a patient as having schizophrenia, we're doing our best to describe a syndrome that has certain things in common, that cuts across different patients who present in a similar way. However, the boundaries to other conditions are very unclear. And within what we define as schizophrenia, there's great heterogeneity. So two patients can both meet the criteria for schizophrenia and look very different descriptively. And some of them will look more like boundary patients, bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, sometimes delirium. Schizophrenia is not a unitary concept in the way we describe the people. It also turns out that even if we can describe people fairly clearly, that the pathogenesis of their symptoms can be remarkably varied. Tolstoy has an expression, all happy families are happy in the same way, every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And what this means, I think, is that to get things right, you have to have all sorts of wonderful things happen. To have things go wrong, you can have lots of individual things go wrong. If it takes trillions of wonderful things happening to make for a normal brain, you could have a vast number of combinations that would be accountable for abnormal behavior. The brain is the most complicated thing in the known universe, and nothing is a close second. And we will never encounter anything as complicated as the human brain. There are 100 billion neurons in a brain. 3 pounds, 100 billion neurons. Almost as many as there are stars in the galaxy. Each of those neurons connects to 1,000 other neurons. Think about that. And to get there, they go through this remarkable fetal choreography of cells differentiating out as nerve cells and then traveling in the weirdest ways to where they wind up. The miracle is not at all that people will have mental and neurological disturbances. The miracle is that it works as well as it does. That we more or less can be in this room and understand each other is a remarkable feat of engineering that evolution accomplished. Also, evolution was working with less than optimal materials. So computer wire can carry information 1,000 times faster than neuronal protoplasm. And it doesn't have to jump a synapse. So everything about our brain is a miracle of engineering and of successful outcomes in the face of overwhelming odds. It proves how powerful natural selection can be. But we shouldn't expect it to be perfect in everyone. And the way things can go wrong are going to be remarkably variable. 30 years ago, we hoped with schizophrenia that we'd find the genes for schizophrenia. And in fact, the genes for schizophrenia were found over and over and over again, especially in the 1980s and in the beginning of the 1990s. Many studies found the gene for schizophrenia, but guess what? None of them replicated. And what's been discovered, the latest paper had about 250 authors. And what they found was there are 108 genes responsible for schizophrenia, each of which a tiny bit different than normal. This was reported as a positive finding, but it's definitely the most negative of findings. It's saying that the permutations to create, the genetic permutations to create something like schizophrenia are so remarkably complex that there will be no simple answer. There will not be simple answers on a genetic basis or a neuroscience basis to explain the mental disorders. The neuroscience in the last 40 years has been the most exciting intellectual adventure in the history of mankind. There's nothing more interesting than seeing how your brain lights up in response to different challenges. No one would have imagined 40 years ago that we'd ever have this window into the brain. But with all we've learned about how the brain works, none of that has helped a single patient. That there isn't one thing in the way psychiatrists practice that, or psychologists practice, or any mental health work practices, that's dependent on a neuroscience finding. Why is this? The jump between basic science and clinical art is an enormous leap. And it's very difficult to take the neuroscience findings and turn it into a new medication that works better than the medications we already have. Now, this is, by the way, true not just for psychiatry, it's true across all of medicine. So that although there's been a tremendous understanding in how the body works, there's been a very great disappointment in how this translates into better treatments. There had been the hope that with an understanding of the genome, we would be able to figure out diseases like that and figure out rational ways of intervening to correct what nature hadn't done right. It turns out that the Human Genome Project, one of the great intellectual adventures of all time, has had a remarkably small effect on medical treatment. And James Watson, the person who discovered the structure of DNA, is remarkably pessimistic. And he was one of the leaders of the Genome Project at the beginning. Remarkably pessimistic about the medical applications of knowing about the genes. Why? Because except for a few illnesses, it's just so complicated. It's just so complicated. Breast cancer. We first discovered, actually at Duke, where I was for many years, we first discovered, not I first discovered, but researchers first discovered genes for breast cancer. Very exciting moment. But it was associated only with a couple of % of breast cancers. And to this day, we have genetic understanding of only a tiny percentage of breast cancers. The breast is the simplest organ in the human body. The brain is the most complicated organ in the human body. If we have trouble understanding how breast works, imagine how difficult it will be to understand the relationship between brain and behavior. And it turns out that when you really study a tumor, you can have a tumor that looks homogeneous, but if you sample the genetics in different parts of the tumor, there are lots of different mutations in different parts of the tumor. The tumor is differentiating, becoming heterogeneous. It's no longer a single cancer. It's many different cancers. That's why it's so hard to treat cancer, because like bacteria, they develop resistances in parts of the tumor to whatever your treatment is. So I guess the point of this is that medical and psychiatric disease is far more complicated than ever we imagined. That if we started out with a simple, naive notion 40 years ago, realist notion, that we could really understand these diseases with just some startling breakthroughs. What we've learned since is that the remarkable skill and the powerful tools we've developed are excellent at teaching us an amazing about the human body. But one of the things we learn is that the human body, and particularly its brain, are ever so much more complicated than we could have imagined. And that understanding it will be a very, very slow process. That you don't expect home runs. Now, why do we expect home runs? There's been an enterprise-wide bias, not just in psychiatry, not just in medicine, but in all of science, for positive findings that don't replicate. The best expression of this is that if you torture a big data set enough, it will confess to almost anything. And what the history of the last 40 years is lots of positive findings being reported that never replicate. And part of that is because the person's done 1,000 analyses, 50 have turned out positive, and that just what you'd expect based on chance, but those 50 get reported as if they're meaningful. That negative data tends to get buried. It's an understandable aspect of human nature on the part of everyone concerned. The scientists will get funding and published only for positive findings. The journals have high impact factors, and readers and libraries subscribing to them only if they have exciting findings. So the journals will select the positive findings, reject the negative, and then they have a public relations office that will have a press release that the cancer's been cured based on a paper this month in our journal. The journalists sell newspapers up until now mostly on the basis of the exciting new applications. And if you read the reports, it feels like cancer doesn't have a chance. We just are getting so far advanced in our understanding that those poor little suckers, those cells just don't have a chance. But it turns out that cancer's a lot smarter than the chemists in the laboratories, a lot faster on its feet, better able to mutate than they are able to come up with new treatments. The bias has people expecting more from the scientific endeavor than is possible, and it leads to excessive patient hope and belief in treatment. So we're going to talk about other forces that are promoting excessive treatment. But part of the problem is patients, us. Part of the problem is that we expect that all of the difficulties, the medical and psychiatric conditions in life should be easily understandable and readily treatable. That since medical science has advanced so far, Aldous Huxley, we should be able to treat and cure all of the medical and mental ills of man. And the fact is that there's been much more hype and hope than there actually has been delivery on that promise. And that the promise itself has created unrealistic expectations amongst all of us about the ability to treat. We're all way too afraid of disease and not nearly afraid enough of treatment. That we all spin a narrative in which if we have even a few of those little prostate cancer cells in our bodies, that's somehow going to be terrible for our long-term futures, and we have to separate the patient from the disease. That we have to somehow make sure that we kill all those cancer cells. We forget what Hippocrates said, that in trying to kill those cancer cells who may be mislabeled as cancer, who won't kill us, we may do terrible disservice to our bodies. We need to be more afraid of treatments and more realistic about them, less afraid of disease. We need to, in evaluating harm-benefit ratios, consider the risks of treatment, not just its benefits. Yeah?
I have a question about...
Do we have a microphone? Yeah. And you have to do me a favor.
Okay.
I'm very old, as he pointed out. I have terrible ears, and also as you get older, you don't process thoughts as fast as you once did. So I'm not going to understand you unless you really speak loud.
So thank you for the first one. Please introduce yourself first.
Hello, Birgitta Koponen. I'm an engineer, and this brand, doctors have its gorgeous brand, great. About the analysis methods, I would like to know that actually happened for me once, happened for many of my friends, that they will go to some test and they are told that, oh my God, you have a cancer. Has happened for me once also. And they will go to those tests again. And there was some mistake in the analysis. You don't have a cancer. Okay, you're healthy. So what's your opinion about this? How many percent, some kind of idea. When it really is some mistake in analysis And when it's healing, do you have any idea?
Yeah. It's an excellent and complicated question. That the more we test, the more likely we are not to miss disease. That's called sensitivity. The lower your threshold for defining disease, and the more tests you do to locate disease, the less likely you are to underdiagnose. You increase your sensitivity. But the more you test, and the more sensitive your tests, the less specific. And you start having a false positive problem. In the history of medicine and psychiatry over the last 40 years, the tendency has been to test a lot more and to have reduced thresholds for defining illness. There's a lot more screening going on with a lower threshold of disease definition. In psychiatry, this meant including new disorders that were close to normality. And we'll be discussing them if we have time. There have been a number of new disorders added to the system that are very easy to mistake for normal functioning. That there's a fuzzy boundary between normal and abnormal, and that boundary is very populated. It's the same thing in medicine. The definitions for diabetes, for hypertension, for osteoporosis, for everything have been reduced over the last 40 years. The screening tests for all of these have been increased. There was the notion, it's a wonderful and noble notion with terrible effects. One way of putting this is that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, but harmful unintended consequences. So the idea behind all of this screening, noble. If we can get there early, we can prevent the problem, or at least lessen it. That if we wait too late, the person will have died or will have had lots of morbidity. Why not screen early and prevent problems? Reduce the thresholds of disease so you could get there earlier before the disease becomes more severe. The problem is that in situation after situation, it turns out when you do long-term studies with a large number of patients over a long period of time, that the screening tests and the reduced thresholds for definition of disease are leading to more trouble than benefit. It's the Hippocrates do no harm. Now, it varies from test to test. So some tests are more accurate than others. Some tests are more useful than others. But basically, if you look at the literature, and it's becoming more and more apparent across many screening tests, that they're more harmful than helpful. The recent recommendations in prostate cancer are the clearest example of this. Up until about 3 years ago, the recommendation in the US was anyone over 60 should have a PSA screening every year. That we're going to get those little prostate cells before they can cause harm, before they'll kill you. In studies of tens of thousands of patients, it was found that doing this didn't prevent the really active prostate cancers from killing you. That you always got there too late for them. They were too quick. What it did was identifying the slow growers that were relatively benign and not going to be a problem. And so we've had so many people overdiagnosed for prostate cancer and harmed by the treatment. This man in the audience over there, Jeppo, raise your hand. Okay, this man's conducted an amazingly interesting study. He's done sham surgery as a control group for people who are actually receiving knee surgery. So you have two groups, randomized. One group is getting the full knee surgery. The other group think they are because they're getting an invasive entry into the knee, but they're not getting the surgery. Guess what? Knee surgery was unnecessary. No better results when you got the knee surgery. When people thought they were going to do better, they did just as well as people who had the knee surgery. We have 1 million knee surgeries like this in America each year. 1 million. And they may, almost all of them, be unnecessary. So you get the theme here. Now, I want to correct a misapprehension, though, that you may have formed. At least in the United States, while we're distracting ourselves treating mild problems that are on the boundary with normality, and I'll be describing them in a little while, we're terribly neglecting people with severe problems. So in the United States, actually, maybe I should do the general first. We spend on medical care almost 18% of our GDP. So almost $1 in $5 is spent on medical care, much of it wasted. But it turns out that the actual outcomes in medicine are more determined by social factors than medical factors. Maybe 80% of the outcome is determined by economic issues, equality issues, smoking. The actual medical treatment, one way of putting this is, if you had a choice over the last 30 years of all the benefits of cancer research or reducing smoking dramatically, you would bet on the smoking. That reducing smoking dramatically has been the biggest boon to the health of the population, much more so than the cancer research. That in the United States, we focus our money on the medical treatments, and the technology is so exciting that many of the treatments are overdone. At the same time, we're not taking care of social factors. If you look at the balance in various countries, it turns out that the total expenditure is not that different if you add up medical and social factors. But in Scandinavia, the Nordic countries, you're much wiser in spending much more on social factors, less on medicine. We have an unreasonable expenditure on trying to treat individuals, and an unreasonable lack of expenditure in trying to make the society as healthy as it could possibly be. And when it comes to psychiatry, we have this terrible problem. Maybe about 5% of the population suffers from a severe psychiatric illness. Those 5% are easy to define. There'll be great reliability in defining them. And we have very effective treatments for them. Not effective enough. It doesn't always work for everyone. It never works enough for any one person. You'd always like more. But we have good medication and psychosocial treatments for the severe mental disorders. However, in the United States, we privatized responsibility for the sickest patients. When we closed the big mental hospitals, we didn't take the money into the community. And well, we did at the beginning. At the beginning, we had community mental health centers. At the beginning, we had better housing. But what happened gradually was we privatized the community mental health centers. This was a way for the states to reduce their budgetary commitment and reduce their moral responsibility for the very ill. The community mental health centers meant well at the beginning, but inevitably they were driven into a profit competition that could only be met by reducing staff and also changing the patient population to the less expensive, less sick, more likely to be able to pay, and away from the severely ill, who had really no political power. These are the most vulnerable people in society. If the society doesn't feel a moral obligation to them, they are ignored. They were ignored in the Middle Ages, tortured, put in poorhouses, subject to all sorts of disgrace and humiliation. And now in the United States, they're being neglected again in the most terrible way. One of the ways I put it is, we closed the snake pits, the terrible mental hospitals of the 60s. But instead of taking care of the people in the community, which is done much better here, I mean, you don't have the same problem we do, but you could if you privatize too much. Instead of providing good care in the community, which was the idea, we've now relegated them to prisons and to dungeons, I call it. Dungeons and back alleys. We have 350,000 people, severely mentally ill, who are in prison. Usually in prison, not because they're super criminals, not because they're violent, but because they urinated in the street, they slept on a park bench, they screamed in the night, they stole food from a 7-Eleven. The police are the first responders. If you read stories about American cops shooting mental patients, and this is happening all the time, it's because the police are first responders. They're not trained to deal with mental patients well, and they're really scared of them. I've spoken to many police who never pulled a gun, except when they're called to see a mental patient. And when they're called to see a mental patient, it's the first reflex, and they fire first too often. They're scared. Why are they so scared of mental patients? Well, first of all, there are too many of them on the street, because they're not getting treated, because they don't have a place to live. We now have 350,000 patients in jail, 350,000 homeless. The police have learned that it makes no sense to take the person to a hospital because they'll have to hang around. They're not released until a disposition is made. And often this takes hours, and usually the disposition is completely useless. An appointment a month away when the person needs help right now. No housing when the person needs a place to stay. We're beginning to recognize the outrage as more and more, and it's really tragic that the way we recognize the outrage is mass killings or pilot dive bombing, that when these dramatic things happen, then people say, well, why aren't we doing more for mental health? We should be doing more for mental health, not because of these rare things that we'll never be able to prevent, but because it's the right thing to do day in and day out for the people involved. So the United States paradox in psychiatry is tremendous overtreatment of the worried well and undertreatment of the really sick. There's been a reductionism on both ends of the biopsychosocial model. When you get old, you swallow stuff in the wrong places. Is that a disease? It's a disease. Surgery? The way I was taught, the way people should act, not just in psychiatry, but in all medical specialties, is to have a biopsychosocial approach to every patient. To try to understand them in that rounded way Hippocrates said we should understand people. What's happened in the United States is we have the NIMH, our National Institute of Mental Health, becoming a brain imaging genetics neuroscience institute that's almost completely uninterested in actual people. Almost completely no funding. When I was young, I was on committees. We funded psychotherapy. We funded health services research. Now, unless a study will indicate a mechanism of brain action, not funded. Completely betting the house on discoveries that we've been trying to make for 40 years and have failed to make, as if we're going to make them in the near future in a way that will help any patients. It's absolutely crazy.
Why is the funding working like that? What's your opinion?
It's very hard to know in life whether things that happen, she's a historian, we were discussing earlier.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? Because maybe everybody.
Why is this happening? Why is anything so stupid happening? To be blunt about it. We were discussing with this historian, does history happen because of inevitable forces or because of individual people? And some combination of both. So part of this is the inevitable force of having a remarkably powerful technology. And it's a wonderful tool, and it's so much fun to play with, and the discoveries are so fascinating, it's hard to resist. It's much less glamorous to be discussing why are people winding up in prison, and how do we get them out of prison. The other is the director, who's been there for about 15 years, very nice guy, means well, but he's completely in love with the biological model, and he's not somehow or other feeling responsible for the people that are around today. So to me, the people around today are we definitely should continue doing biological research in the brain, that's for sure, but we shouldn't be betting the whole budget on that, especially since we have the experience of the last years that the findings will be, the brain is elusive, the secrets are there, but they're very elusive and they're retail, not wholesale. There aren't breakthroughs. It's finding out a little bit about this and a little bit about that. That's not going to be enough to help current patients. He should be spending his money more judiciously across the board, not all in one area, I think. But a lot has to do with him. I think a lot has to do with the power of the technology. There was the same kind of biological reductionism in Europe between about 1850 and 1900, when the neuron and the synapse were discovered. That all sorts of weird theories developed around the biology that didn't really explain behavior that well, but made sense and were plausible and were legitimized by the biological discoveries. So I think that we need to have a biopsychosocial model in our research and our practice, not just bio. But we also have a psychosocial reductionism. The worst culprits here, most recently, is the British Psychological Society. And I'm lately have done a blog with the lady who wrote this, and today I'm working on a blog with her, a follow-up, the lady who was the leader of the British Psychological Society. They've come up with a reductionistic psychosocial view that hearing voices is normal, and it is normal in some, and therefore why are we making this a medical model and pathologizing it? Why are we so intent on giving medication? And this is the work of naive people who just haven't seen the severely ill. I mean, I think if they had spent a little time in prisons, going from cell to cell, seeing the patient screaming at their hallucinations and smearing excrement on the walls, they'd have a different view. If you deal with basically healthy people, it's easy to say that the medical model is completely wrong. If you deal with people who are only sick, you may overemphasize the medical model. What we need is a joining. We need all three legs of the tripod. We need to understand that some people will need medicine. But that doesn't mean they also don't need psychological understanding, that they don't need an appreciation of social context, that they don't need a place to sleep. It's a decent place to sleep. No one should ever have a pure medical model, even for medical diseases, because they're so socially, contextually responsive. On the other hand, to just have a psychosocial model misses the point with some people who terribly need medicine. And we also have patient groups in the United States, some of them made up with people who are very harmed by psychiatry and understandably think it's a good idea to stay away from psychiatry because for them it was, that their treatment was worse than their disorders. But they make the assumption that what happened to them applies to everyone else. And they don't take responsibility in their actions or dialogue for the people who are sicker than they are, who need help that they didn't need. So they're against medicine for everyone, they're against coercive treatment for everyone. I'm against coercive treatment, but at this point, coercive treatment is almost impossible to get in the United States because there's so little treatment. 50 years ago, Thomas Szasz wrote The Myth of Mental Illness. Do you know that name here? 50 years ago, 54 years ago. He died 2 years ago. When he wrote the book challenging the warehousing of patients in mental hospitals and the coercion, he was absolutely right. But his followers act as if that's the current problem. The current problem of coercion isn't psychiatric hospitals. There are very few beds left. Almost impossible to get into a bed. Length of stay, 7 days. The real problem now is prison. And coercive psychiatric treatment is sometimes the only way to get a person not be imprisoned. So we need to have a balanced model. Yeah?
My name is Manta Tolvanen. I'm a child neurologist from Tampere. Very interesting talk. And my question is that I only treat children. So what is your opinion when a lot of adult psychiatrists say that untreated ADHD can lead into a prison or into some personal disorder? I can't remember the name. And I have to comment that this is so much depends on the society, because in Finland you can urinate in the streets and no one takes you into prison. It's very normal here.
Say that again?
In Finland, men are allowed to urinate in the streets because they drink so much, and it's pretty much normal here, and no one gets arrested for that.
Not a disease.
Yeah, it's not a disease here, but in the United States.
How about women?
Depends on the situation. There are days you are allowed to do it.
Okay. It's a little bit off where we're going. Maybe it'll be more fun if we do it this way. So I won't do so much formal talk. You'll ask questions and we'll get there. ADHD is one of the things that I feel badly about. When we finished our work in DSM-IV, we were pretty happy that we had stopped the tendency towards overdiagnosis. We made very few changes. There were 94 suggestions. We added only 2, and they both turned out to be problems. We can discuss those if you're interested. 3 years after DSM-IV was completed, the drug companies in America, which pretty much own the politicians, They spend vast fortunes on lobbying politicians. The politicians often work for the drug industry when they're done being politicians. The people in the drug industry are often brought into the government, and the lobbyists for the industry often write the laws pretty much. They got the right in America to advertise directly to consumers. So you can't imagine what that's like. In America, when you're watching TV, it's a constant series of drug ads. Very few car ads, very few ads for soap anymore, some beer ads, and drug ads. The internet is filled with information provided by drug companies. The drug company marketing of ADD was outrageous. It made it sound like every kid who was a little rambunctious had a mental disorder, that mental disorder was due to a chemical imbalance, and the way to treat it was to give the kid a stimulant medicine. Now, the reason that they were able to and willing to do this was that just at the same time as they got the right to advertise, they came up with new medicines. The new medicines were not at all better than the old medicines. They never are. In psychiatry and sadly in a lot of medicine, new drugs are Me Too drugs. And they look fancy and they get lots of advertising, but often they're no more effective than the basic pioneer drugs in that particular class. But Ritalin was pennies a pill in 1994. The whole industry was about $40 million in the US. The new medicines were dollars a pill. That gave, and they had a long patent life, that gave the industry the motive, and the ability to advertise gave them the means to push up the rates of ADD. The lesson here is that a diagnosis is, the rates of a diagnosis are not just determined by what's written on the paper. The rates are determined about how it's applied. And how it's applied is very much vulnerable to the social context. So one powerful force driving the overdiagnosis of ADD was the drug company marketing push. But also, parents have become increasingly perfectionistic about their kids. And there was a feeling like, why should my kid not be the best in every class? Parents bought this idea that ADD was very common, underdiagnosed chemical imbalance. Instead of protecting their kids from medication, they often encouraged it. Commercials helped them to believe it. We also had teachers who watched the same commercials. And our class sizes are too big. Finland has the very best educational system in the world, with the possible exception of Singapore and maybe Shanghai. We get constant articles, by the way, about Finland's educational system. It's constantly being held up. What are we doing wrong compared to Finland? Yours is the model that people think we should be following. But in our schools, there are too many kids, too many social problems, too few gym periods. As the school budgets were reduced, there was less time for kids to be out in the playground running around. Take a kid who's normally active and sit him down all day, and he'll look hyperactive. The rate of ADD has tripled in the United States, from about 3.5% to 4% to maybe 11%. The rate of ADHD in teenage boys is, get this, 20%. Can you imagine that? The rate of medication in teenage boys is 10%. Now, some people would say, we previously were underdiagnosing and now we have it about right. That's nonsense, especially when you have all these social forces pushing it. You can imagine that there's an excess, that there's an overreach, that you go from what might have been underdiagnosis, although I don't think it was, to way overdiagnosis. Whenever you see a big rise in rates, it doesn't mean the people have changed. It means that the way the system is used has been changed. And we have compelling evidence that overdiagnosis is the problem. In a bunch of countries, it's been studied, and the best predictor of an ADD diagnosis is your birthday. If you're the youngest kid in the class, you're almost twice as likely as the oldest kid in the class to get the diagnosis. Turning childhood, turning immaturity into a disease. I mean, that's a great one. If you ask people on your survey, should childhood be a disease? No one would say yes. But if you look at what's happening in real life, we're turning childhood into a disease. We're turning immaturity, being the youngest kid in the class, into a disease. And the general problem here is taking an educational problem and a social problem, and instead of solving that, turning it into a disorder in the individual. Instead of spending money on smaller class sizes, on more gym periods, on more individual attention, we're spending $10 billion on medication. Wrong way of doing things. And as we go along, if people are interested, we'll point out other areas where that's being done, where we're turning the social problem into an individual medical or mental disorder. Are there other questions at this point? Yeah.
Okay. My name is Marja Viervara, and I'm a psychiatrist. I would be interested about your ideas about the big pharma and their money to the scientific... about big pharma and the marketing money and the scientific ideal and the research ideal.
I missed the point. About what?
Big pharma and their money.
Oh, big pharma. Oh,
yes,
okay.
and the scientific ideal.
Okay. The pharmaceutical industry has loyalty to its shareholders and to the executive salaries. It has no particular loyalty to patients or responsibility for patients. It markets its products not with a social conscience, but with a profit motive. Big Pharma spends twice as much money on marketing and on controlling politicians as it does on research. And most of its research is more infomercial than real research. It's mostly to produce a Me Too drug that expands the patent life. I don't need that. Why was I using that? Yeah, it's mostly to develop Me Too drugs that expand patent life. It's to develop drugs that have a different side effect profile that more people are willing to take. Big Pharma is not much more, well, how mean should I be? I'll be really mean. I'll give you an example. We now, Be frank. Okay, we now have more deaths in the United States from prescription narcotic painkillers, many more deaths than we do from all other drugs combined. We have half as many deaths from prescription painkillers as we do from car accidents. 16,000 deaths a year. The drug companies are more responsible for deaths by overdose than the drug cartels. And they have been fined, but it doesn't stop the behavior because the fines are never big enough compared to the rewards, and the executives never go to jail. There have been about $15 billion or more fines in the last 12 years, and it hasn't stopped because it's so lucrative to be marketing in the way they market. You can't believe, I think it's hard to believe anything you read in any journal these days, but you especially can never believe something that comes from a pharmaceutical study. And I think we need to have a very high index of suspicion. I think we need to teach people that medicine doesn't solve all problems. It can cause its own set of problems. But at the same time, we have to teach people that when they have a clear-cut psychiatric disorder, they need help. So it's two messages in one, and that can be confusing. It's the underdiagnosis, overdiagnosis issue that we have both. We have the worst of both worlds. We have underdiagnosis of people who really need it, the 5%. We have overdiagnosis of people who don't. The epidemiological studies are interesting. The reports vary, but if you do one-shot evaluations around the world, the numbers are about the same. You get a value of about 25% for people to have had a mental disorder in the prior year. 25%. If you ask lifetime, you get a value of about 50%. If you do prospective studies, the numbers are much, much higher. If you say you study kids every 2 years from the time they're 12 to the time they're 21, 81% will get a psychiatric diagnosis. It gets ludicrous. Adults, if you study them from 18 to 31, 50% would have an anxiety disorder, 40% would have a mood disorder. Almost equivalent rates of substance disorder. The point here is that the epidemiological studies are conducted in such a way that they really represent no more than an upper limit of disorder. Because when you're conducting vast numbers, ends of 5,000, 10,000, you can't have careful clinical interviews. So most of the epidemiological studies are done by telephone. It's a lay interviewer with minimal training who's not allowed to judge clinical significance. If you have, since psychiatric symptoms are so widely distributed in the population, unless you're able to correct for the fact that there must be clinically significant impairment or distress, you get these very high numbers. A lot of the people reported as having the disorder don't. They have some of the symptoms, but they don't have the symptoms in sufficient severity and duration to really make for a clinical diagnosis, but they get it. We should do clinical epidemiology in our field and others, but we should be careful in how it's reported, that these are upper limits rather than true values. That's not done, partly because the scientists like reporting the high numbers. The NIMH absolutely loves the high numbers because that supports their budget recommendations. The patients like the high numbers because that reduces stigma. If everyone's sick, then no one really is sick. And the people who really love the high numbers are the drug companies because it allows them to advertise, aha. So we have a diagnosis called major depressive disorder. Major depressive disorder can be the very worst experience anyone can have in life. It can be worse than having schizophrenia. Be the most painful, most horrible, can have a terrible prognosis, has a pretty high suicide rate when it's severe. But major depressive disorder also includes, within its rubric, the mildest of conditions that are maybe no more than the aches and pains and sadnesses of everyday life. They both get included under major depressive disorder. If you do a survey, and the way it works is the severe people with major depressive, that's a small number. The mild people, it's a large number. Whenever you're at the boundary with normality, you're on the part of the bell-shaped curve, there's lots of people. Severe psychiatric disorder, maybe 5%. If you include milder problems on the boundary, 25%. The studies will be reported that we have a rate of major depressive disorder in the last year of, say, 12% in the population, and only 4% of the people got treatment. Now, what that hides is that, and they'll say, why aren't we treating the other 8%? What that hides is that those 8% may not need treatment. That they may be wise in not seeking treatment. They may be the worried well who don't need treatment. And also what's often not reported is that we do definitely need to be seeking out the people who have severe depression. In the United States, people with severe depression, only 1/3 of them get treated for it in the previous year. So we're way over-treating lots of people because of placebo response, way under-treating people who desperately need it. The placebo response rate increases dramatically as you deal with less severe problems. So if you're dealing with a severe psychiatric problem, schizophrenia, severe OCD, severe bipolar disorder, the placebo response rate's under 10%. The response rate to treatment may be 40 or 50%. You have a 5-to-1 ratio, response to placebo, active drug to placebo. If you're talking about milder problems, the placebo rate jumps up to 50%. So on average, Hippocrates said 30%. 30% is a good idea. If you take everyone, 30% is a pretty good approximation of placebo response. But the severe patients are going to be much less. The mild patients, and maybe people who aren't really sick, they're going to have a high placebo response rate. The active drug has little or no advantage over placebo in mild problems. The same thing as Tepo with knees. But once you have the surgery and your knee feels better, you think it's the surgery that did it. Once you start the medication, you didn't need the medication. You would have been better anyway. But if you start the medication, you believe it's the medication. Once you took arsenic in the medieval ages, made you sick for a while, but you got better, you assumed it was the arsenic, even though it was more poison than a good thing. So what we need to be doing is consistently identifying those people in that group that Hippocrates noted who needed the active medicine. That's the group we should be identifying. Instead, we're focusing our attention too much on the people who have gotten better anyway. Yes. No, you go first because she already had a turn.
All right, my name is Chris Hoynes. I'm a teacher. I'm curious on the legal framework in the States surrounding this over-medication, and if that is part of the problem here, that if you don't prescribe anything or if you don't give a diagnosis, you'll be held responsible for that misdiagnosis or the mistake there. And then second, what are your thoughts on improving the situation as you see it now?
How to improve it?
Especially with the over-prescription of the drugs. Under the less 5%, that seems to be more of a political problem, giving the resources and such, but the over-prescription.
Okay, the first question has to do with legal issues. It was felt, and probably is to some degree true, that American doctors practice defensively because they're fearful of malpractice suits. And it's easier to sue someone for missing something than for doing an extra test. So the doctor takes a patient with prostate cancer, gives him a surgery that makes him impotent and incontinent, puts him on an estrogen that gives him breasts, and he gets fat and loses energy. And the doctor's not going to be sued. Because there was a thing that said, aha, a slide was read as prostate cancer. But if the doctor didn't do the PSA, he might be afraid of being sued. This is changing to some degree because people, like your friends here, are pointing out how stupid that is. And it's becoming more community standard. When the urologists don't like this, but when the people who do guidelines in the US said no more PSA testing, it took away that malpractice risk. And also the states have reduced malpractice vulnerability. But here's a really interesting thing. We have a thing called the Veterans Administration. It's run by the federal government. Those doctors don't make more money when they do more tests. And they don't have to worry about being sued. And they're almost as bad in terms of over-testing as everyone else. What this says to some degree is that the culture has pushed people to the extreme of over-testing. And that even if you take away the medical liability risk, even if you take away the profit motive, people are so entranced by the technology and so imbued with the culture, they don't automatically change. The only way this will change, that's your next question. How do we tame this? Well, my best analogy is the tobacco industry. That 30 years ago, the rate of smoking around the world was over 50%. And if we were in this meeting, a bunch of you would be smoking. Now it's almost impossible to find a doctor or a teacher smoking. In the US, almost completely impossible. You can't, where I live in California, you can't smoke on the beach. You can't smoke in public. If you smoke anywhere, people look at you as if there's something really sick about you. There's something wrong with you. It's a sickness, smoking. You didn't have it here, but it would be seen almost as there's something either low class or sick about you or dirty about you smoking.
We actually had it.
Huh?
We actually had it, so I have to show
it was down, but they didn't declare it a sickness. It's not a sickness by this. But in the US, it's felt to be that way. What's wrong with you? You're smoking. How did that happen? How did the big culture change? It was a David and Goliath struggle with the people against the tobacco industry, just a tiny group, and the tobacco industry having all the money in the world and hiring the best lawyers. The people won, and it's an inspiring thing, I think, that every once in a while, right does make might. The people won. There were lawsuits. There was a combination of public outrage, the press, and lawsuits. And when the tobacco industry was fined a lot of money, some of that money was directed to advertising. And the advertising before, the tobacco industry used to be the most frequent advertiser on TV. It would always have this really virile guy, the Marlboro man smoking a cigarette, very manly. Or it would have this beautiful, sexy girl. And she'd be hugging that cigarette as if it were a sex organ. This was replaced by people who were dying with cancer, who could barely get their next breath and were coughing up stuff. And the advertising had a tremendous impact on public attitudes. Now, what's the parallel here? We have a huge, powerful, worldwide industry that's promoting harmful, I think, over-treatment of the wrong people. We have a very small group of people involved in trying to stop it. But the momentum of the small group of people is growing. That we met at an overdiagnosis conference that meets every year now. There's a thing called the Lown Institute, a foundation that has its own meeting on overdiagnosis every year. The journals, especially the British Medical Journal, have made this their crusade. And the drug companies are so outrageous. In America, to treat hepatitis C now costs $84,000. It's $1,000 a pill. Some cancer injections are $75,000. It's clear that they're trying to suck out every last, your money or your life. It's like taking people who are sick and holding them up. How much money do you have? I'll take that for this pill. I think that there's a growing public outrage. At this point, the government in the US cannot negotiate price with drug companies, even though it's by far the biggest purchaser of drugs in the world, because the drug companies have written the rules so they can't negotiate. It's not a free market. It's an asymmetrical, unfree market. I think that some things are just so crazy they can't persist in the long run. And as Abraham Lincoln put it, you can fool all the people some of the time, some of the people all the time, but not all the people all the time. And I think that they've gone so far. Now, I could be, and probably am, completely wrong. I read a Wall Street prediction just a few days ago saying that the pharmaceutical industry now makes revenues of $400 billion a year in the US, and they expect in 5 years to go up to $550 billion. So the smart money is saying it's going to keep growing, but the smart money would have voted for tobacco. The latest scam is personalized medicine. Do you hear much about that here?
Yes.
Yeah, the idea will be that we haven't found breakthrough drugs that work for large groups of people, but there's going to be this miraculous series of findings that will allow you to figure out just which molecule is necessary for your problem. I say this is a scam because, again, this is a very complicated world, and it's not as if we've had breakthroughs before in personalized medicine. The idea that all of a sudden, my assumption is low-hanging fruit has been picked, and we will inevitably advance in our knowledge tremendously, inevitably advance in our therapeutic tools, but that will be much slower with a big lag. And that whenever something is an exciting new thing in the field, it's hype. And the business interests here are tremendous. So that almost every professor in an American medical school is thinking about how can I get a company out of my research. So all of the research is given much more glamorous, we're going to cure cancer patina than really is worth. We should be very much concerned about providing the best possible treatment we can with the powerful tools we already have, rather than dreaming that there'll be a sudden explosion of wonderful technology in the future. And the problem with the hype is it gets people in the mindset of, I need the treatment. There's a total mindset of, there must be a treatment for this because I read in the paper that we're discovering this, we're discovering that. People, again, I repeat, need to be more afraid of the treatments, a little bit less afraid, more knowledgeable about the conditions. Yes?
I think the one question here is that why do we need the diagnosis so much for treating children? I see all the time that there are no healthy children in Finnish daycare centers or schools anymore. Everyone needs to have diagnosis. And these are diagnoses that are not treated with drugs or medication or surgery. Yep. They need other things, rehabilitation or something extra from the school. We have same problems, the social problems, the class sizes and all that. And I think not everyone should have a diagnosis.
Yeah. The child people have been even more adventurous than the adult people in inventing new diagnoses. And I'm concerned about that because I think children are the hardest people in the world to diagnose. They're developmentally different. There's a lot of heterogeneity within normal. There are different speeds of development that shouldn't be pathologized, as we mentioned for ADD. We should respect diversity. They're subject to pressures from school, from family, and they change a lot from meeting to meeting. So I think that my recommendation in diagnosing children is do it really slowly. Unless it's absolutely classical, and it rarely is. Don't make a diagnosis on the first visit. Don't make a diagnosis on the second visit. Get to know the family and the kid over a period of time. See how things evolve before you jump to a diagnosis. I should mention Asperger's, autism. Asperger's was one of 2 diagnoses that we included in DSM-IV that were not previously included. The reason that we included Asperger's was that the definition of classic autism was so rigid and so tough that only a very small number of kids were diagnosed with it. That had a virtue but a liability. The virtue was that it was absolutely unmistakable. The liability was that child psychiatrists, pediatricians, family doctors said they saw kids who were in many ways like the kids with classic autism, but who didn't have the communication problems. So they had normal IQs or maybe superior IQs. They had normal speech, although maybe a little weird, nerdy speech, but they had the problems in social relatedness and had stereotyped weird interests. We included it and did a field trial that suggested that it would triple the rate of autism. The rate of autism has since gone up 50 times, not triple. Why? In the US, autism is a key to a much better school experience. Much more personal attention. You may be 1-to-1 at times during the day, 1-to-4. And school systems were sued by parents to provide these very enriched services for kids who got the diagnosis of Asperger's. It was robbing Peter to pay Paul, because if you put the money in this, you're depriving someone else. Many of the kids who get the diagnosis of autism don't get the diagnosis on a repeat visit and don't get the diagnosis with a careful evaluation. It's become a quick way to provide a service, an educational service. The autism associations love the fact that the rates have changed. It used to be 1 in 2,000. The latest rate in the US was 1 in 68. 1 in 2000 and 1 in 68. Korea, a study financed by the Autism Association, 1 in 38. Now this isn't that people are getting more autistic. It's a change in the way the criteria were widened by DSM-IV in a way that they're being very loosely applied in practice, because it has, the point here is that any time a diagnosis has a reward attached to it, more people will get the diagnosis inappropriately. And while the child might be helped in the short run, it can be devastating in the long run to be stigmatized with a diagnosis. Now, the Autism Association loves it when there are more people who are diagnosed as autistic, because it reduces to some degree the stigma of autism, the more people who have it. But for the individuals, I get emails all the time on, my child got this diagnosis, and these are all the bad things that happened since. We shouldn't be solving school problems, again, with a diagnosis of autism. And it's crazy to have a clinical diagnosis developed by clinicians for clinical purposes determining school services. If the kid needs more attention, give him more attention, but not because of this diagnosis, but because of his particular situation. So the DSM tends to be misused every time it's taken out of its specific purpose. It's misused in the courts, it's misused in the schools, it's misused in disability determinations, where the only way the person can pay the rent maybe next month is if they're declared disabled because of a psychiatric condition. And once they're declared disabled, they almost never wind up working again. We should be providing better help for everyone who's unemployed, not requiring a disability determination, a mental disability, to get benefits. It's interesting, Denmark, which is, by the way, the happiest country in the world, and I'm not sure where Finland comes in. Do you know?
No comment.
Huh? No comment? In most countries, the happiness index goes way down when unemployment goes up. In Denmark, it doesn't. Why? Because they have a better social safety net. It's not as devastating. Another instance of this is PTSD. Our troops returning from the same battle zones as troops from Britain have 10 times the rate of PTSD. Why? It's the only way to get benefits. We take kids and subject them to terrible experiences. They naturally will have reactions, psychological reactions to those experiences. We don't provide them with very much support in getting back into a civilian economy. The whole group has been labeled as a PTSD generation because of the high rates. Hard for them to get jobs. The only way they get benefits is by having a mental disorder diagnosis. Be smarter, better, more humane to take care of it. Well, first of all, don't start stupid wars. Don't send kids into situations that make no sense. But if you're going to do something that dumb, at least take care of them when they come back without giving them a mental disorder diagnosis.
Okay, please.
Yeah, hi. My name is Jesper Eklund. I'm a professor of psychiatry at Helsinki University. So I guess we all agree on the problem that is there, and I guess you have described the causes very nicely in your book, for example, and in your talk. I guess the question is what to do about it, as we have been discussing here. And I would like your thoughts on two very strong, big political movements that are going on in Finland at the moment. I would say we have the election coming up and everything. So one is repeated over and over to move money from specialized care to general practice, as a thinking of saving money and intervening earlier. So that's one big trend that's talked about a lot. And the other one is like a political mantra, I would say, that prevention is always cheaper than intervention. And I guess it's true, of course, if we can do it, and if we can do it cheaply. But the question, of course, the burden of evidence, of course, to show that it works. And we have strong NGOs that push this agenda very strongly.
Who pushes it?
NGOs, non-governmental organizations that are lobbying for this kind of thinking. And I guess of course the idea would be, of course, to prevent, as you say. But I guess the burden of evidence would be to show first before moving money away from specialized care to that. So it's about it's like a mindset that is being pushed for, and I think in the political debate is a kind of non-critically accepted as a truth. So these two kind of political developments are quite strong, and I would like your opinions about them.
Okay, the prevention issue is what got me started criticizing DSM-IV. The DSM-IV wanted to have a paradigm shift, and their first hope was a biological paradigm shift. That failed. Their second hope was a dimensional paradigm shift. That failed. And so basically the changes in DSM-IV were all in the direction of allowing in milder conditions that would hopefully be treated early enough to prevent the development of more severe conditions. And the one that exercised me, fortunately, was kicked out, and that was pre-psychotic syndrome. It's interesting that Australia is investing $500 million on trying to prevent psychosis. The Australian of the Year in 2010 was a psychiatrist who's the most powerful, charismatic psychiatrist who ever lived. And he has convinced both political parties in Australia that it would be political suicide to not support his program for preventing psychosis. I got exercised about this for the following reason. I think it applies to all prevention programs in psychiatry. We are not good at predicting the future. We're not good at saying who's going to be psychotic, who's going to be depressed. We're not good at saying who's going to take an airplane and fly into the ground with it. We can predict high-risk groups, but we can't predict individuals. For suicide, for anything, violence, we can't do that. We have good predictors for the risk group, bad predictors for the individual person. And when it comes to pre-psychotic syndrome, again, remember, Australia is investing $500 million in this. When it comes to pre-psychotic syndrome, in the best of clinics, only 30% of the people, the kids, are correctly identified. The other 70% are false positives. They said, oh, you're at ultra-high risk for psychosis. They risk getting antipsychotic medication, and yet the false positive rate's enormous. In actual practice, it's 90% false positive rate. Some countries are beginning to test 3- and 4-year-olds. New Zealand tests 3- and 4-year-olds. The immediate result of that was doubling the rate of ADHD. Pre-screening leads to even more overdiagnosis. Pre-screening in psychiatry should learn from screening in the rest of medicine that it's going to create more problems than it's worth. I think it's an absolute disaster. It's a great idea. That's the point of good intentions leading to terrible unintended consequences. It's a great and noble idea that we can't realize, and it has horrible unintended consequences. Now, the other question is really interesting. What about enhancing primary care? In the United States, primary care doctors give out 80% of the psychiatric drugs. So most of psychiatry is done not by psychiatrists, but by primary care doctors. They give out 90% of the benzodiazepines. Benzodiazepines are horrible medicines. They should be off the market. But 90% of them, and they're still very, even though off patent, they're very popular with patients. They're very much involved in overdoses, especially with alcohol and with the painkillers. They should be off the market, but 90% of them are given out by primary care doctors. 80% of antidepressants, primary care doctors. 60% of stimulants, primary care doctors. And 50% of antipsychotics. Now there's no way that we can have enough psychiatrists to be doing all psychiatry. But there's also no way that we can expect primary care doctors to do an adequate job of handling patients who may need help if they have little training in psychiatry, often little interest, not always, but often. If they have 7 minutes with each patient, which is true in the United States, 10 at the most. If they get paid only if they make a diagnosis. So in the States, they have to make a diagnosis to get paid. That's the insurance company policy. That rushes the diagnostic process. A good diagnosis is a joy forever. It improves the therapeutic relationship and improves the person's life. A bad diagnosis is a disaster that you often can't undo. It's easy to underdiagnose, and I always recommend underdiagnosing, except when everything's clear-cut. It's very hard to get rid of a diagnosis. You're haunted by it once you get it. So that the primary care doctors, I think, are a necessary part of the package, but I think you need to have enough of them so they get to know their patients, and I think they have to be retrained to get away from the reflex. See, if you have 7 minutes with a patient and you want to send them away happy, what do? You take the free sample off the shelf that your friendly drug salesman gave you, and you give the patient a free sample. This wasn't a waste of time coming to see you. I got something out of it. I think we have to re-educate the doctors and the patients to the fact that careless diagnosis and careless prescribing is much more dangerous than watchful waiting. I think privatization is beginning to be a problem. I was in Norway and Sweden before coming here, and it's very obvious it was beginning to become a problem in both countries, and it's a great danger to all sorts of medical health. That the private companies promise everything at the beginning. The government likes the deal because they can offload responsibility and cut their financial responsibility. But it winds up that the money that is pulled out in profit, which is often considerable, is money that's deprived to patient care. I think you may be in a slightly better position because of the population size. So the smaller the population, the less interested they are in the market. But the tendency has been in Britain, particularly, to devolve the National Health Service, and that's spilling over to the other Scandinavian countries. And that's the thing I would resist most.
Al, there's another comment in the middle.
Yes, my name is Markus Mattsson. I'm a PhD student of psychology, and I'd like to hear your take on psychological case formulation.
On what?
On psychological case formulation against diagnosis, because some suggest that diagnosis should be altogether replaced by a case formulation.
You have to go slower for my ears.
Oh, okay. Excuse me. Sometimes you hear suggestions to replace diagnosis altogether with psychological case formulations. And what's your take on that?
Well, first of all, let me make clear that I'm very much a believer in psychotherapy. And for mild to moderate problems, psychotherapy is better than medication. It has short-term outcomes that are almost equivalent and much better long-term outcome. I think it should be relatively easy. Most people don't want more than 5 sessions of psychotherapy. And it should be relatively easy for people to get 5 sessions. And the medication should be reserved for people who really need it after it hasn't worked. Now again, medication for the severely ill, the 5%. But if someone's on the boundary, psychotherapy first. But the efforts to get rid of diagnosis are very silly, I think, and show a naivete about what life is like, real life is like. It was weird. The week that DSM-IV came out, this is May 2 years ago, the head of the NIMH said it was stupid because it wasn't biological enough, and the NIMH was going to work harder to make it biological in the future. And the psychologist said it was stupid because it was too much medical model. Both of these are absolutely wrong. I think that if you just have psychological formulation, you're completely idiosyncratic. Everyone comes up with their own ideas and they will never agree. We've done the experiment on this. We had years before DSM-IV, and there was absolutely no agreement in the field. And when there's no agreement in the field, it lacks credibility. Why should we listen to anyone more than anyone else? You need to have a system that can potentially provide agreement on certain basic factors in that individual that are in common with other individuals. But that shouldn't be the end of the day. That should be the beginning of the evaluation or part of the evaluation. The rest of the evaluation needs to focus on what's individual to that person, what's idiosyncratic and particular to them. So that clinicians who only know the DSM, I think, are useless, sometimes dangerous. Clinicians who know nothing about diagnosis, I think, are useless and sometimes harmful. That you have to be able to combine in your evaluation what is the same about this people than other people, and also what's special and different. The thing with psychosis that the British Psychological Society did ignores the fact that you can get psychosis in many different ways. It can be substance-induced. It can be due to a general medical condition. It can be due to delirium. It can be due to dementia. It can be part of what we call schizophrenia. It can be part of what we call bipolar disorder, part of major depressive disorder, part of catatonia. Each of these names is imperfect. None of them is a true disease, but they're all valuable because you do different things for each. You don't act as if all people with hallucinations are normal, because that's going to lead to a disastrous neglect of them that gets them in prison or on the streets. You don't act as if it's not worthwhile to be thinking, is this due to substance, is this due to delirium? That these distinctions, although imperfect, are clinically and practically enormously valuable. And so I think that there's an ideology on the part of the director of the NIMH, we need biological answers or nothing else counts. There's an ideology on the part of the British Psychological Society that these distinctions are going to prevent you from really dealing with the patient. And that's just absolutely wrong. I'm doing this blog with the lady who was the leader of that, and we're arguing about the last paragraph. If you're interested, read the blog. And she acts as if the only people who really understand patients are the ones who don't use diagnosis. The only people who sit down and talk to people as if they're people are people who abandon diagnosis. That's absolute nonsense. That the best way to deal with patients is to get close to them and understand them psychologically. What's the voice saying? Why is it saying that? What's happening in your life? That's absolutely important dealing with a psychotic patient. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't be worried about the fact that the psychosis may be related to a condition that needs attention in its own right. So I think anyone who has a new idea that's brilliant and reductionistic is more dangerous than helpful. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Dennis. I'm a psychologist. I just wanted to ask about the DSM itself, because when I worked in therapy, there was a trend when there were a lot of kind of conditions and disorders removed from it, like a lot of gender dysmorphism disorders, etc. I'm more curious about the DSM-IV and what is the trend. For example, you mentioned one trend that is introducing more milder disorders into it, but I'm more curious about what are the clusters and what is the general trend, and what are the maybe socio-political factors that are playing in it?
Yeah. The biggest factor in advancing the diagnoses I'll describe to you in a moment is not drug company pressure. The drug companies never pressure the people working on DSM. They're on the sidelines. They're eager. The minute they have something they can exploit, they'll exploit it, and I'll describe how they've done this with binge eating disorder. But they never try to influence the process at all. Never have a phone call, ever. The reason why the diagnoses have been expanded has mostly to do with intellectual conflict of interest. That experts in any given area will inherently begin to love their area. I've worked with thousands of them over the years. Never one did someone come up to me and say, you know what, let's narrow my category. They have a great concern about missing patients and almost a complete indifference to mislabeling patients. They only worry about false negatives. They never worry about false positives. They overvalue the science in their area. So I'll mention the DSM-IV suggestions, but the thing that's clear about them is that if you had a more neutral group that didn't give experts the last shot, you would have a much better way of doing guidelines. You can't do guidelines without including experts, but you should never let them, I call it the fox guarding the hen house. The word here, he says buck guarding the cabbages, and someone else had a different one. But you don't let experts make final decisions. You need a guideline process that's broadly inclusive. And this is true of every disorder. I'm working with a guideline group that's trying to define rules of disease definition and guidelines across all of medicine and surgery. And one of the principal arguments is you need to have a neutral group that's not overly influenced by the experts, that's more influenced by the evidence. And evidence not interpreted by the experts in the field because they always overvalue their own work. They're the researchers in the field. But by people who have, like this guy, who have a lot of experience in evidence-based medicine. You need people like him doing guidelines across the board, not people who have a vested interest. The DSM-IV suggestions that I objected to. The one that's most recent is binge eating disorder. The guy who was head of that committee, he was an old friend, he'd been the head of my committee in DSM-IV, and I said, this is the stupidest idea in the world because pretty soon they'll be saying binge eating disorder needs diet pills. He said, you know what, there are people out there who have binge eating disorder and they're missed. I said, so what? How's that compared to millions of people getting diet pills they don't need? He said, but the science says that we should do this. I said, you know, the science is not that strong, Tim. We both know that. He said, well, you know, cognitive therapy is helpful for this. I said, most of the people aren't going to be getting cognitive therapy. They're going to be getting diet pills. He said, that's an education problem. We'll have to spread the word about cognitive therapy. I said, the word will be spread by the drug companies. A month ago, they got approval. The drug company got approval. Shai got approval for its speed pill for BED, for binge eating disorder. It got expedited approval at the FDA. Why? Because the FDA is very much controlled by the drug companies. And since it was already being used for ADD, why not extend the indication? But when they extend the indication, that allows the salesman to tell the doctors, this is underdiagnosed, we have a medicine for it, here's the free samples for your patients. This is how the system can get abused. This guy has absolutely no interest in helping drug companies. He's absolutely honest and wonderful. He's smart as can be. But like most experts, he's naive about the implications of his suggestions in the real world. What would work for him in his research clinic wonderfully well is a disaster when it gets to primary care free samples in the real world. Diagnosis I have is minor neurocognitive disorder, introduced by DSM-IV. The idea here is that once someone has full-blown Alzheimer's, it's too late. The nerves are dead. What we need to do is identify people early on, treat them preventively before the nerves are dead in a way that will save the nerves. This has been the holy grail for the last 30 years. I started in 1980 asking people, how long will it be before we have a test for Alzheimer's? It was always about 5 years. Still 5 years. The brain is much more complicated than we ever give it credit for. It really holds its secrets very close to the vest. Why is it a terrible idea to introduce minor neurocognitive disorder? There's no treatment for Alzheimer's. There's no treatment for minor neurocognitive disorder. It's going to be so common in people like me who have trouble finding their car at a mall that everyone's going to think they have it. Unscrupulous commercial interests will start, and they have started, peddling brain exercises that will prevent Alzheimer's. There'll be tests for Alzheimer's that haven't been confirmed. People will start getting imaging before we really know whether the imaging is useful. We'll have tons of false positives. And what good is it to think that you're going to have Alzheimer's in the future when it's uncertain? The odds are going to be on the false positive side, undoubtedly, and there's nothing you can do about it now. So this is, again, researchers in an area wanting it to be true. And again, the people who did this had absolutely no commercial interest. And they're absolutely the smartest people in the world. But experts can be remarkably smart in everything except what the misuse of their suggestions are in the real world. Another really dumb suggestion was called temper dysregulation disorder. And now it's called disruptive mood dysregulation disorder because some of us made fun of temper dysregulation disorder on the presumption that lots of kids, including my grandchildren, would deserve the diagnosis and would receive medication for it. The reason for including this diagnosis was discussed over the excessive use of the term childhood bipolar disorder in kids, which had increased dramatically in the US, even though we had rejected it for DSM-IV. Thought leaders giving talks had promoted the idea that in children, bipolar disorder presented itself very differently. It didn't have the high swings and lows, highs and lows. Instead, it was more temperamentalness. So kids with temper tantrums were starting to be treated as if they were prodromal bipolar disorder, given medication. Now, by the way, we have tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of kids 2 years old, 3 years old on medication. It's absolutely astounding. There are 10,000 kids in the US, 2 and 3 years old, on stimulant medication for ADD. And many kids are getting antidepressants, antipsychotic drugs at very young ages. Absolutely outrageous. So the idea for DSM-IV was, let's introduce this new, not so terrible disorder that doesn't have the implication of bipolar with medication, lifelong course, and that will take away bipolar disorder. Again, remarkably dumb. There had been one researcher who had done research on this. She's very smart, but it had only been 6 years of research. She had no idea how this would be misused in the general population. If you want to attack childhood bipolar disorder, have a campaign against it. Have conferences, how stupid it is to be diagnosing kids with a disorder that's been rejected. Why are we giving kids medication at such a young age when there's no evidence it'll work? Go after the problem. Don't substitute another diagnosis that can add to the problem, because now we'll have a whole new group of kids being diagnosed with temper dysregulation. They made it easier rather than harder to get adult ADD. Now, every adult wishes they could concentrate more. The boundary between normal concentration problems and pathology is impossible to draw. It's all in the eye of the beholder. Every psychiatric disorder causes attention problems. Every single one. So if you make attention deficit disorder a diagnosis, you have 3 problems. You're going to overdiagnose normality, you're going to miss psychiatric disorder, and you're going to give people an easy way to get recreational performance-enhancing drugs. If they want to study harder over the weekend because they have a test on Monday, I have ADD. If they want to have a party, I have ADD. We already have 30% of our college kids and 10% of our high school kids buying illegal ADD drugs in a secondary market. If you make adult ADD an easy diagnosis to get, they made it easier. They really wanted to make it easy. You're just encouraging this. The other 2 most controversial diagnoses were grief is now easily confused with major depressive disorder. In DSM-IV, if you had severe mood disorder after losing a loved one, you could make the diagnosis. Someone's suicidal, delusional, completely unable to function, you could make the diagnosis. But for at least 2 months after the loss of a loved one, if you had mild symptoms that are completely indistinguishable, grief or mild depression, you don't diagnose depression, you assume it's grief. DSM-IV has it now that after 2 weeks, if you feel sad, you lose interest, you lose appetite, you're not having a good time sleeping, and you have less energy, that's enough to diagnose major depressive disorder. And a drug company is already working on an indication for major depressive disorder in people who are grieving. Grief is mammalian. The price of loving people is to feel bad when you lose them. It's actually not just mammalian. Birds experience grieving. We shouldn't reduce the dignity of people's response to the loss of a loved one by saying it's sickness. People here had the sense not to do that. The people, grief was one of the things that wasn't included. The people who suggested this for DSM-IV are 3 of the smartest people in the world. But absolutely blind. We had arguments that went on for years over this, in print and in person. absolutely blind to the risks of overdiagnosis and intent on no one should ever be depressed and not be diagnosed during a period of bereavement. Completely worried about false negatives, completely blind to false positives. This led to the most public controversy. There were a number of editorials, several in The Lancet, the editorials in the New York Times. It was carried in hundreds of newspapers how dumb this was. Everyone understood it was dumb. The only 3 people who didn't understand it was dumb were the 3 people working on DSM-IV, who again are the smartest people in the world, except in this area. The last one that was most controversial was somatic symptom disorder. We had a thing called somatization in DSM-IV, very hard to make. The people who work in settings with people who have medical illness felt that they would like to have a more flexible diagnosis. So they made it the most flexible diagnosis in the world. You just have to have one symptom and a doctor thinking that you're too worried about it. The definition now covers 26% of people with pain and irritable bowel. It covers 13% of cancer patients. So you're a cancer patient, you get a headache, you worry you have a metastasis, the doctor thinks you're worried too much, he can say you have somatic symptom disorder. The people who have uncertain things like chronic fatigue syndrome, very hard to know what chronic fatigue syndrome is because it's not going to be one thing, it's going to be hundreds of different things. We should, when we're uncertain about something, retain that uncertainty. So if we don't understand what chronic fatigue syndrome is, we shouldn't assume it's a psychiatric disorder. We should accept the fact that there's uncertainty. The people who have this, or irritable bowel, or any number of other conditions, are very worried that the doctor will say, it's just in your head. Not do a thorough medical workup, not do a thorough psychiatric workup, it's just in your head. And so this is a loosening of the system that I think makes no common sense. None of these loosenings makes any common sense and is sensible only to the smartest people in the world who are blinded by their focus in their own narrow area.
But everybody else